I was enjoying this, and I wanted to share. I thought this was an interesting part.
Her forehead and said, "I must be losing my mind." And young Jude comes and stands in front of her and says, "Mommy, whatever you do, please don't ever lose your heart, because I'm in there." Who told him that? Who told him to say that? It's the idea of a pristine imagination, for out of the mouths of babes you have ordained praise. So you see the death of God, you see the pluralistic rise of worldviews, you see the power of the imagination. I'll give you 3 quick responses in particular. The question is this: how do you reach a generation that listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings? How do you reach a generation that listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings? Number 1, you have to let them not just hear the gospel, but see it. They have to be able to see the gospel. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. David Hume, the Scottish skeptic, was going to hear George Whitefield speak, and putting on his raincoat hurriedly on the sidewalk, somebody said to him, "Where are you going in such a hurry?" He says, "I'm going to hear George Whitefield speaking." Somebody says to him, "You don't believe what Whitefield does, do you?" He says, "No, but I want to hear a man who does." I want to hear and I want to see a man who does. The world is longing to see the embodiment of the Christian message, the love of God that we talk so much about. Almost every Muslim that comes to Christ, I have 2 of my dear friends here from Syria, they'll sustain it for you, students here. Almost every Muslim that comes to Christ, if you ask them how it happened, they will tell you in one of 2 ways. Number 1, God spoke to them in a dream, using their own worldview to get through to them. Or number 2, they saw the love of Christ in somebody. They saw the love of Christ in somebody. I have so many that I talk to around the world, so many, and they'll always say, "There was so-and-so who was my friend. The love that he showed me, the love that she showed me, the loving relationship that they had for my family and for my friends." They are waiting to see what the gospel is all about. And when you bind the wounded, when you are there for the hurting, and you love people from counter perspectives, they are willing to see what it is that you're really talking about. You know, the famed missionary Joseph Damien from Belgium ministered in Hawaii, in the island of Molokai, where all the people with leprosy from Hawaii were sent to be treated. And Damien went in place of his brother who'd suddenly passed away. So he arrives into Molokai, one of the most beautiful islands in the world, and he's treating these people with leprosy. My wife and I had the privilege of going to Molokai and seeing what kind of work he had established. He built a chapel there. He would put his arms around them. He would embrace them. Every morning he would have a chapel for them. All of a sudden, one day he's pouring a kettle of boiling water into a cup. The water comes swirling out and falls onto his bare foot. He noticed for the first time he had no feeling. He was stunned. He took the same kettle, gently poured it onto the other foot, no feeling. He knew what had happened. He'd contracted leprosy. That morning, nobody in the audience knew why he said what he did. He always began his sermons by saying, "My fellow believers." This morning he began by saying, "My fellow lepers." My fellow lepers. There's a grave there that marks his burial site. So I asked the guide, "So this is where Damien is buried?" They said, "No, he was. But the Belgian government demanded that his body be flown back. He was a hero to them. And they asked for the body to be sent back. The people resisted, but the Belgian government had its way to get the body back. But the people there with leprosy said, "Could you cut off that right hand or that right arm, one of the 2, and bury it here and take the rest of the body back?" Because that was the hand that touched us. That was the hand that touched us. It is ironic in Corinth today to look at all the horrible things that went up on the mountain at the temple of Aphrodite stood there. And right at the bottom of that mountain is the church at Corinth. And outside that church, carved in stone, is 1 Corinthians 13. That great chapter on love. The counter perspectives set there one against the other. They're going to have to see. Number two, it's going to have to be a message that's not merely argued, but also felt. It has to be felt. There has to be that conviction. We hear so little of this these days, it's troubling me, so that everything becomes cerebral and so little of that personal walk with Christ that he calls us to. You see, I came to know Christ on a bed of suicide when I was 17. In fact, I'm standing by any moment now to get a telephone call from Calgary, because the man who sent the individual with the Bible in his hand to come to my hospital room in Delhi while I was a teen, facing hopelessness and therefore tried to take my own life. This man by the name of John Tabe in Calgary, Alberta, is in his last hours of life. And 3 months ago on a phone he said to me, would you do me the favor of coming and preaching at my funeral while I'm gone? So these last 2 days we've been talking back and forth of John Tabe in his final hours. What I want to say to you is this. I was a man who was lost. I was a man who was headed in the wrong direction. And this Bible is brought into my hospital room and I give my life to Jesus Christ. That moment didn't end at that moment. That has lasted me over all these decades of life and kept me going. That as a lost individual, Christ sent somebody to my room with the Word of God, which I'd never owned and never opened in my life, that God cared enough for me to send the message to me in my hospital room. And that's why Francis Thompson writes, O world invisible we view thee, O world intangible we touch thee, O world unknowable we know thee, inapprehensible we clutch thee. Does a fish soar to find the ocean, an eagle plunge to find the air? Do we ask of the stars in motion if they have rumor of thee there? Not where the wheeling systems darken, or our benumbed conceiving soars, the drift of pinions would we hearken, beats on our own clay-shuttered doors. The angels keep their ancient places, touch but a stone and start a wing. 'Tis your strange faces that have missed the many splendid thing. But when so sad thou canst not sadder, crying upon thy so sore loss, shall shine the traffic of Jacob's ladder between heaven and Charing Cross. Yea, in the night, my soul, my daughter, cry clutching heaven by the hems, lo, Christ walking on the water, not of Gennesaret but Thames.
Pretty intense. Pretty intense. I'll leave the link. I thought it was... It's a good one. It's a gooder.